Hey everyone, and welcome to this new video. After receiving numerous comments about Raspberry Pi and SSDs from my last videos, I want to talk to you about this topic right after the intro. Enjoy. There still seems to be a lot of uncertainty regarding Raspberry Pi and SSD, as some have asked me if I could make a video about it. And also, I have an older video in which I talked about the disadvantages of Raspberry Pis. Because apparently there is still a general opinion that one could use a Raspberry Pi for just about any project. And I have a somewhat different opinion on that. Sure, Raspberry Pi are really cool and you can use them for a lot of things, but for some projects, there are simply better solutions. And this brings me to the fact that Raspberry Pis and SSDs also have some disadvantages. On one hand, and this is probably the most obvious point, the Raspberry Pi is connected to an SSD via USB, and USB simply cannot deliver the speeds that, for example, a PC can provide via SATA or even PCI. So, the Raspberry Pi can never read and write as fast as a PC. Furthermore, and this has repeatedly stood out to me in the recent smart home projects, the Raspberry Pi cannot work perfectly with SSDs. USB adapters bypass. Some of them simply do not work properly and repeatedly cause problems. Recently, I had the case where I wanted to install Home Assistant on a Raspberry Pi with an SSD, and in the end, the Raspberry Pi simply would not start once the SSD was connected. It turned out that the SATA USB adapter just did not work. That means there are some adapters that work quite well with the Raspberry Pi, while others do not work at all. I'll link my preferred adapter below in the description. I use it as well, and it works at least 90% of the time. I wanted to set up Home Assistant supervised, essentially running Home Assistant on a regular Linux system, and then have it run on the Raspberry Pi. However, some tools that the supervisor requires do not work over an SSD, and accordingly, I had to use Home Assistant OS, which is the complete operating system, in the end. It has been running on my Raspberry Pi for some time now, and I am relatively confident about it. However, I had another problem, namely that I use a Zigbee adapter to control all my lamps and other smart home devices here. However, it seems that the cable from the SATA to USB adapter and the Zigbee stick are so close to each other because the USB ports on the Raspberry Pi are naturally very close together that the Zigbee adapter did not work. The only solution in this case is to use a USB extension to move the Zigbee adapter a bit further away from the Raspberry Pi. Only then is it possible to get Zigbee to work reasonably well. These are not things that are super bad, but first of all, you need to know them. Secondly, it takes an enormous amount of time to figure all of this out, which I have now explained to you in 3 minutes. And thirdly, it is also not immediately obvious to everyone. And with that, I maintain the opinion that a Raspberry Pi is not suitable for every project. If you still want to try it out, as mentioned, it's best to use the adapter that I have linked below. I have had really very good experiences with it. I will also link you to a good guide that I used to copy all the data from the internal SD card to an SSD. Therefore, it should be relatively easy to get started with an SSD if you take all the tips here into account and are aware that you will indeed have to make some compromises. I hope I was able to clarify the topic once again. I will continue to use the Raspberry Pi, and next week there will be a video on how I set up a Bitcoin node on this Raspberry Pi, and I am really curious to see how well it works. How many GB of data I then pack onto a hard drive. If you want to see the video, don't forget to subscribe. We'll see each other again next week on Wednesday at 1:00. Until then, take care and goodbye. Yuzen.